Our 1,000 years ago, the Great Pyramid of Giza looked nothing like it does today. Its surface was covered in 144,000 polished white limestone blocks, cut so precisely that the seams between them were nearly invisible. The entire structure was a single, seamless, reflective face, visible from mountains in Israel, according to some ancient accounts. Blindingly bright under the desert sun, a beacon that could be seen for 100 miles. Almost all of those casing stones are gone now. The standard explanation is earthquake damage and medieval salvaging. But what if removing those stones didn't just change how the pyramid looked? What if it disabled what the pyramid did? The Great Pyramid of Giza stands today as a stepped and weathered monument, its sand-colored stones exposed to the wind and the sun, looking almost like a giant staircase rising from the desert plateau. And this is the image we carry in our minds when we think of the pyramids, this rough and ancient pile of blocks that has somehow survived for 4,500 years. But this image is incomplete because it shows us what the pyramid has become rather than what it once was. And what it once was is so different from what we see today that it almost qualifies as a different structure entirely. Because the Great Pyramid was not always this exposed skeleton of limestone blocks. It was once covered entirely and seamlessly in a skin of polished white stone that transformed it into something that would be almost unrecognizable to modern eyes. 144,000 individual casing stones, made of fine Tura limestone, quarried from the hills across the Nile and ferried across the river and hauled up the plateau and fitted into place with a precision that still challenges our understanding of ancient capabilities. Each of these stones weighed approximately 15 tons and was cut so exactly that the joints between them measured fractions of an inch, so tight that you could not slip a piece of paper between them, so seamless that the entire exterior of the pyramid presented itself as a single continuous surface with no visible gaps or interruptions. And this surface was not merely smooth, but polished, worked to a reflective sheen that caught the Egyptian sun and threw it back across the landscape. And if you had approached the Great Pyramid in the centuries after its completion, you would have experienced something that no living person has ever seen. Because from a distance of several miles, the pyramid would have appeared as a pure geometric form rising from the desert, so clean and so bright against the brown and gold of the sand that it would have seemed almost artificial, almost impossible, a perfect white triangle floating above the earth. And as you drew closer, the intensity of the reflected light would have increased until the structure became genuinely difficult to look at directly, especially in the hours around midday when the sun was highest. The entire surface would have blazed with reflected sunlight, not the dull glow of painted stone, but the sharp brilliance of a mirror. And travelers approaching from the east would have seen the pyramid catching the first light of dawn before the sun had fully risen above the horizon. The apex would have begun to glow while the desert floor was still in shadow, a single point of light appearing in the darkness and then spreading downward as the sun climbed higher. And in the evening, the same phenomenon would have occurred in reverse, the pyramid holding the light of the setting sun even as the land around it fell into twilight, a beacon visible according to some ancient accounts from as far as the mountains of Israel. And this is not the pyramid we know. This is not the stepped and weathered monument that appears in photographs and documentaries. This is something else entirely. A structure of such geometric perfection and such visual intensity that it would have dominated the landscape in a way we can barely imagine today. But those casing stones are gone now, almost all of them. Only a few remain at the base of the structure where they were protected by accumulated sand and debris, and the question of where they went has a standard answer that appears in most histories of the monument in the year 1303 CE. A massive earthquake struck the region and damaged the casing stones, cracking them and dislodging them and leaving them vulnerable to removal. And in the decades that followed, the Bahri Sultan al-Nasir, Nasir ad-Din al-Hassan, ordered the damaged stones to be salvaged and transported to Cairo, where they were used to construct mosques and fortresses and other buildings, including the Hassan Mosque, which still stands today, its walls containing stone that once formed the skin of the Great Pyramid. And this explanation is documented and largely accepted. There are historical records of the earthquake and historical records of the salvaging, and you can visit Cairo today and see buildings that were constructed from pyramid stone. So in one sense, the mystery is solved. We know what happened to the casing stones. They were damaged by an earthquake and then removed for building material, a practical act of recycling in a time when dressed stone was valuable and the pyramids were seen less as sacred monuments than as convenient quarries. But here is where we must pause and ask a different kind of question, because knowing what happened is not the same as understanding what it meant. And the difference between those two things is precisely where this story begins to become strange. If the casing stones were purely decorative, if they were simply a beautiful shell wrapped around a tomb to make it impressive and visually striking, then their removal was nothing more than the loss of an aesthetic feature. Regrettable from an archaeological perspective, but not significant in any deeper sense. The pyramid would have lost its beauty, but retained its essence. A tomb remains a tomb whether it is polished or weathered. But what if the casing stones were not decorative? What if that seamless, airtight exterior was not simply a shell, but a component? What if the precision of those joints, that almost inconceivable precision that allowed no gap between stones, was not merely a display of craftsmanship, but a functional requirement? What if the pyramid needed to be sealed? And if so, what did that seal contain, or what did it keep out, or what process did it enable that could only occur within an enclosed space? These are not questions that the standard explanation addresses, because the standard explanation assumes that decoration is the only possible function of beauty, that if something looks impressive, it must have been designed only to look impressive. But the builders of the Great Pyramid did not cut 144,000 stones to fractions of an inch because they wanted tourists to be impressed. They did it because the design required that level of precision. And if the design required it, then there must have been a reason the design required it, and that reason has never been adequately explained. We'll consider what we know about the casing stones themselves. They were cut from Tura limestone, a fine-grained white stone that was prized in ancient Egypt for its beauty and its workability. But Tura limestone is not merely beautiful. It has specific properties that distinguish it from the coarser limestone used in the pyramid's core. It is denser and less porous. When polished, it becomes nearly impermeable to water and air. A structure clad entirely in polished Tura limestone would have been not just visually seamless, but atmospherically sealed. Whatever was inside would have been isolated from whatever was outside. and the joints between the stones, those joints that measured hundredths of an inch, would have completed the seal. No air would have passed through. No moisture would have penetrated. The interior of the pyramid would have existed in a state of atmospheric isolation from the exterior world. Now, this may have been intentional, or it may have been incidental. It is possible that the builders simply wanted the pyramid to look perfect and achieved atmospheric sealing as a byproduct. But it is also possible that the atmospheric sealing was the point, and the visual perfection was the byproduct. We assume the former because we have already decided what pyramids were for. They were tombs. Tombs do not need to be atmospherically sealed. Therefore, the sealing must have been incidental. But this is circular reasoning. We are using our assumption about the pyramid's purpose to explain away evidence that might challenge that assumption. And if we set aside our assumptions for a moment and simply look at the evidence, we see a structure that was designed and built to be completely sealed. And then we see that seal being systematically removed over a period of centuries. And we have to ask ourselves what that removal meant, not in terms of what it did to the pyramid's appearance. We already know that. It made the pyramid look the way it looks today. But what it did to the pyramid's function, if it had a function, what capability was lost when the skin was stripped away? The earthquake of 1303 damaged the casing stones. That is documented. The salvaging by al-Nasir. Nasir ad-Din al-Hassan removed them. That is documented. But documentation of an event is not the same as explanation of its significance. And the significance of removing the casing stones depends entirely on what those casing stones were doing. If they were doing nothing but looking beautiful, their removal was a tragedy of aesthetics. If they were doing something else, their removal was something more. And that something more is what this story is about. Because the casing stones were not the only component of the pyramid that has been lost, or altered, or removed. They were only the exterior, only the skin. And beneath the skin there were other systems that have also changed over the millennia, systems that may also have been functional. And when we begin to look at those systems, when we begin to trace what has happened to each component of the pyramid over the past 4,000 years, a pattern begins to emerge. A pattern that looks less like natural decay and more like something else. But before we can see that pattern clearly, we need to look beneath the surface. Because the casing stones were only the beginning. But the casing stones were only the exterior. And beneath the pyramid, something else was moving, something that most visitors never see and most documentaries never mention. Water. The Great Pyramid sits on the Giza plateau today, and the plateau is dry, baked by the sun, surrounded by desert. And when we think of Egypt, we think of sand and heat, and the absence of water except for the Nile itself, which flows some miles to the east. But this was not always the geography of Giza. In antiquity, the Nile ran much closer to the plateau. Archaeological evidence suggests that a branch of the river may have flowed within a few hundred meters of the pyramid complex, close enough that boats could have docked at a harbor connected to the valley temple by a canal. And this proximity to water was not incidental. The entire pyramid complex was designed around water. Channels carried it from the river to the site. Basins collected it. Conduits directed it beneath and around the structures. And the water table itself, the level of groundwater beneath the surface, was significantly higher than it is today, which means that the bedrock beneath the pyramids was saturated with water. Water was moving through the ground beneath the pyramid, flowing through channels both natural and constructed, and this water was not merely present, it was active. It was doing something. To understand what it might have been doing, we need to descend into the pyramid itself, not up into the famous chambers that tourists visit, but down into the bedrock beneath the structure. Because carved into the living rock 100 feet below the base of the pyramid is a chamber, the subterranean chamber. And this chamber is one of the strangest spaces in the entire complex. It is rough and unfinished in appearance, with an irregular ceiling and a floor that is cut at different levels. And there is a shaft in the floor that descends even deeper into the rock, a shaft that has never been fully explored. And the standard explanation for this chamber is that it was an abandoned burial site, that the builders began carving a tomb here, and then changed their plans and moved the burial location higher into the pyramid, which is why the chamber looks unfinished. But this explanation has problems. The chamber does not look like an abandoned project. It looks like a completed space that we do not understand. The irregularities in its design may be irregularities only if we assume it was meant to be a smooth rectangular room. But what if it was not meant to be smooth? What if the irregular surfaces were intentional, designed to interact with something in a specific way? And here is where water becomes relevant again. Because this chamber, 100 feet below ground level, would have been at or below the ancient water table. Water would have been present in this space, or flowing near it, and moving water creates vibration. Specifically, it creates low-frequency vibration, infrasound, sound below the range of human hearing, but not below the range of human perception. We feel infrasound, even when we cannot hear it. It creates sensations of unease or awe. It affects our bodies, even though our ears cannot detect it. And the subterranean chamber has been acoustically measured. It is a resonant space. It amplifies certain frequencies. It sustains sound in ways that other spaces do not. And if water was flowing beneath or around this chamber, it would have been generating continuous low-frequency vibration, and that vibration would have been amplified by the chamber's resonant properties. This is not speculation. This is physics. Water flow creates vibration. Resonant chambers amplify vibration. The subterranean chamber is a resonant chamber. Water once flowed beneath and around it. But we have to be careful here, because I am not claiming to know what this system did. I am simply noting that the components of a system are present, and those components interact in ways that we can describe, even if we cannot explain their purpose. And this brings us to the Osiris shaft, discovered in the causeway area of the Giza complex, a vertical shaft that descends through multiple levels into a chamber that contains water to this day, a subterranean water chamber connected to the pyramid complex. And the Valley Temple shows evidence of water channeling, grooves and channels cut into the stone that once carried water into and through the structure. And when we begin to map these water features, when we begin to trace the channels and shafts and chambers that were connected to water, we find that the entire plateau was networked with hydraulic infrastructure. Water was everywhere in this system, flowing and collected and channeled and stored, and today almost all of that water is gone. The Nile has shifted course over the millennia, moving away from the plateau. The water table has dropped as the climate has changed. And as modern irrigation projects have drawn water from the aquifer, the channels that once flowed are now dry. The chambers that once held water are now empty. The entire hydraulic system that was integrated with the pyramid complex has been disrupted and, in many places, destroyed. And if water was a functional component of whatever the pyramid was doing, if the continuous flow of water beneath the structure was generating the low-frequency vibration that the subterranean chamber was amplifying, then cutting off that water would have been like cutting the power supply to a machine. The machine might still exist, the structure might still stand, but the energy source that made it function would be gone. And this is the second component that we have to consider. First, the casing stones. The sealed exterior that was stripped away over centuries, and now the water, the underground flow that was diverted and diminished over millennia. Two components of a potential system, both now altered or removed, and we have not even gone inside the pyramid yet. We have not even looked at what sits above that subterranean chamber, waiting to receive whatever vibration was being generated below. But the exterior sealed the structure, and the water energized it from below. And between those two elements, something else was waiting. Something made of a different stone entirely. Something that may have been the heart of the whole system. The exterior sealed, and the water flowed beneath. But what happened in between? What occupied the space within that sealed shell above that vibrating foundation? And to answer this, we have to climb. Up through the ascending passage, up through the grand gallery with its corbelled walls rising overhead, up into the chamber that sits near the heart of the pyramid, the room called the King's Chamber. And when you enter this space, you notice immediately that something is different. The walls are not limestone. The walls are granite, red granite from Aswan. And this is not a small detail. This is perhaps the most significant architectural choice in the entire structure, because Aswan is 500 miles south of Giza, 500 miles up the Nile against the current. And granite is one of the hardest and heaviest stones that the ancient Egyptians worked with. Transporting it from Aswan to Giza was an enormous undertaking. It required boats capable of carrying multi-ton blocks. It required a river deep enough to float those boats. It required labor and logistics and planning on a scale that challenges our understanding of ancient capabilities. And the builders did not use granite for the entire pyramid. They used limestone for almost everything. The core blocks are limestone. The casing stones were limestone. The passages are lined with limestone. But when they reached the king's chamber, they switched to granite. And they did not just use a little granite. They used granite for everything. The floor is granite. The walls are granite, the ceiling is granite, and above the ceiling there are 5 more layers of granite, massive slabs stacked one above the other in a structure known as the relieving chambers. And the standard explanation for all this granite is structural. The relieving chambers are said to distribute the weight of the pyramid above the king's chamber, preventing the ceiling from collapsing. And this explanation makes sense structurally, but it does not explain why granite specifically. Limestone can bear weight. The rest of the pyramid is limestone. The builders clearly knew how to work with limestone. They used it for everything else. So why did they switch to granite for this one chamber and the spaces above it? Why did they go to the extraordinary trouble of quarrying granite in Aswan and transporting it 500 miles and shaping it with tools that we still do not fully understand? What property does granite have that limestone does not? And here is where the answer becomes interesting, because granite has several properties that distinguish it from limestone. Granite is harder, granite is denser, granite is more durable. But granite also has a property that limestone completely lacks. Granite is piezoelectric. This is not alternative history. This is physics. Piezoelectricity is a well-documented phenomenon. Certain crystalline materials generate an electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress. When you squeeze them or vibrate them, they produce electricity, and granite contains quartz. Quartz is piezoelectric. When granite is compressed or vibrated, it generates a measurable electrical charge. Now, I am not claiming that the ancient Egyptians understood piezoelectricity in modern scientific terms. I am not claiming they had a theory of electron flow or crystal lattice structures. But I am noting that they chose, with great effort and at enormous expense, the one commonly available building stone that has this property, and they placed it in a chamber that has documented acoustic properties. Multiple studies have measured the resonant frequency of the king's chamber. It resonates at approximately 110 Hz. This is a frequency that falls within a range that affects human consciousness. It is found in other ancient structures around the world. The hypogeum in Malta resonates at similar frequencies. Newgrange in Ireland has chambers that amplify similar tones. There appears to be a global pattern of ancient builders creating spaces that resonate at these specific frequencies, and the king's chamber fits this pattern exactly. It is a resonant chamber, it amplifies sound, it sustains tones. It behaves acoustically like an instrument, not like a room. And above this resonant chamber are 5 layers of granite slabs, stacked with spaces between them. And the function of these relieving chambers has never been fully explained. Yes, they distribute weight, but why 5 separate chambers? Why not a single massive slab? Why are there spaces between the layers? What do those spaces do? If the subterranean chamber below was generating low-frequency vibration from the water flowing beneath it, and if that vibration was traveling up through the bedrock and into the structure, then the granite chamber would have received that vibration, and the granite would have responded to that vibration, and the response would have been electrical. This is not speculation. This is what granite does. This is what piezoelectric materials do. They convert mechanical energy into electrical energy. And the king's chamber is a precisely constructed box of piezoelectric material sitting above a vibration source and inside a sealed shell. The components of a system are present. The relationships between those components are observable. What we cannot observe is what the system produced or what it was for. But the architecture suggests that it was for something. You do not transport granite 500 miles because you like the color. You do not cut chambers to resonant frequencies by accident. You do not stack 5 layers of massive slabs above a room unless those slabs are doing something. And the sarcophagus in the king's chamber, the granite box that is supposed to have held a body but was found empty. This sarcophagus also has resonant properties. When struck, it produces a tone. It rings like a bell. And its dimensions appear to be related to the resonant dimensions of the room itself. Everything in this space seems designed to vibrate, to resonate, to convert one form of energy into another. And if that is what this space was doing, then the granite was not decorative, it was functional, and the function depended on vibration, and the vibration depended on water, and the entire system depended on the sealed exterior to contain whatever it was producing. And we have already seen that the sealed exterior is gone, and the water is gone, and the granite remains. But it is silent now. no longer receiving the vibration that made it active, a resonator without an input, an instrument that no one plays anymore. The shell was intact, and the water moved, and the granite resonated. But what received the output? What sat at the apex of this system and gathered whatever it was producing? And here we encounter the strangest absence of all, because the Great Pyramid has no capstone. Climb to the top of the pyramid today, and you will not find a point. You will find a flat platform approximately 30 feet on each side, a truncated apex where the final element of the structure should be, but is not. And when you ask what happened to the capstone, the answer is that we do not know. There is no documentation of when it was removed. There is no documentation of who removed it. There is no archaeological evidence of what it was made of. There is no clear record of anyone in ancient times describing what it looked like. And this absence is, when you consider it carefully, genuinely extraordinary. The capstone would have been the single most visible element of the finished pyramid, the point that caught the light, the geometric completion of the form. It would have been the first thing any visitor noticed, the apex gleaming above that vast white surface, catching the first light of dawn and the last light of dusk. And yet we have no reliable ancient accounts describing it. Herodotus visited Egypt and wrote about the pyramids, but did not describe the capstone in detail. Diodorus Siculus wrote about the pyramids, but did not describe the capstone in detail. The medieval Arab writers who documented the salvaging of the casing stones did not describe removing a capstone. It is as if the capstone was already gone before reliable historical records began, and this creates a mystery that has never been adequately addressed. Where did it go? Who took it? And perhaps most importantly, what was it made of? Some theories suggest it was made of gold, a solid gold pyramidion that would have blazed with reflected sunlight. Other theories suggest it was electrum, an alloy of gold and silver that was prized in ancient Egypt for its brilliant appearance. Other theories suggest it was simply granite or limestone like the rest of the structure. And other theories suggest it was made of something else entirely, something we have no record of. And still other theories suggest that the pyramid was never finished, that the capstone was never installed, that the truncated apex is original. But this last theory has problems. The ancient Egyptians clearly knew how to complete pyramids. Other pyramids have capstones or evidence of capstones. The builders of the Great Pyramid demonstrated extraordinary precision and planning in every other aspect of the structure. It seems unlikely that they would have left the apex unfinished, and if they did finish it, if there was once a capstone at the apex of the Great Pyramid, then that capstone is gone, and we do not know where it went or when it left or what it was. And this absence takes on a different significance when we consider the pyramid as a system rather than a monument. If the sealed exterior contained something, and the water provided energy and the granite chambers converted that energy into something else, then the capstone would have been the apex of that system, the focal point, the output point, the place where whatever the pyramid produced would have been concentrated or emitted or gathered. And in many proposed theories of pyramid function, the capstone plays a crucial role. It is the electrode that discharges energy, the antenna that emits signals, the collector that gathers cosmic radiation, the conductor that connects Earth to sky. And I am not endorsing any of these specific theories. I am simply noting that in all of them, the capstone is essential. It is not decorative, it is functional, and its removal would not merely change the pyramid's appearance, it would disable the pyramid's purpose, whatever that purpose was. And this is the third component that we must add to our list. The casing stones that sealed the exterior are gone. The water that energized the base is gone, and the capstone that crowned the apex is gone. Three components of a potential system, all missing, all removed or altered over time. And what remains is the granite core, still present but silent, still intact but inactive, a resonator without input and without output, a machine that has been disconnected at every point where it interfaced with the outside world. Let us pause and consider what we have described, because the picture that emerges is unlike the picture we usually see when we think about the pyramids. The usual picture is of a tomb, a monument, a wonder of the ancient world, impressive and mysterious, but fundamentally passive. A pile of stones arranged in a geometric shape to honor a dead king. And that picture may be correct. It is the picture that mainstream archaeology endorses, and it is based on considerable evidence. But the picture we have been assembling is different. In this picture, the pyramid is not passive but active, not a monument, but a machine, a structure designed to do something rather than simply to be something. And the components of this machine are as follows. First, an exterior shell made of 144,000 polished limestone blocks, cut so precisely that the entire surface was atmospherically sealed, creating an enclosed space isolated from the outside environment. Second, a subterranean system connected to water flow, with channels and chambers that would have generated continuous low-frequency vibration as water moved through and around them. Third, a core of granite chambers positioned above the water system, constructed of piezoelectric material and tuned to resonant frequencies, capable of converting mechanical vibration into electrical energy. And fourth, an apex element, a capstone of unknown material, positioned at the focal point of the geometry, where whatever the system produced would have been concentrated or emitted, and every one of these components has been removed or altered. The casing stones were stripped away beginning in the 14th century and continuing for several centuries thereafter. The water systems were disrupted by the changing course of the Nile and the lowering of the water table, and the construction of upstream dams and irrigation projects. The capstone was removed at some unknown time by unknown persons for unknown reasons, leaving a truncated apex where the completion of the form should be. And only the granite core remains intact, sitting there in the darkness inside the pyramid, waiting for inputs that no longer come, and producing outputs that no longer have anywhere to go. And when we look at this pattern of removal, we have to ask what it means. We have to ask whether it is coincidence or something more. And there are three possible framings for what happened. The first framing is neglect. In this view, the pyramid was abandoned after the end of the Old Kingdom. Its purpose was forgotten, its priesthood disbanded, its maintenance ended. And over the following millennia, natural processes of decay, combined with opportunistic salvaging, gradually dismantled the functional components. Earthquakes damaged the casing stones, and so they were taken for building material, climate change, and river shifting. Cut off the water supply, the capstone fell or was removed by treasure hunters, and none of this was deliberate in the sense of intentional sabotage. It was simply what happens to structures that are no longer maintained. They fall apart, and this is the conventional view, the one that requires no special explanation. The second framing is accident. In this view, the systems that made the pyramid function were never meant to last forever. They were designed for a specific period of use. And then they naturally wound down. The builders knew that the Nile would eventually shift, that the water table would eventually drop, that the casing stones would eventually weather. And they accepted this. The pyramid was a machine with a limited lifespan, and that lifespan has simply expired. And this framing also requires no special explanation. It simply accepts that all things end. But there is a third framing, and it is the one we have been implicitly approaching throughout this section. In this view, someone at some point understood what the pyramid was and systematically disabled it. The casing stones were not just salvaged for building material, they were removed because they needed to be removed. The water was not just naturally diverted, it was cut off. The capstone was not just lost to time, it was taken, and in this framing the pyramid did not decay. It was decommissioned, it was shut down, and the shutting down was deliberate. And I want to be clear that I am not advocating for this framing. I am not claiming to know that it is true. I am simply noting that it exists as a possibility and asking why we have never seriously considered it. Because if the pyramid was functional, if it was doing something that mattered, then its disassembly would have been a significant act. And the question of who did it and why would be one of the most important questions in history. And yet we have never asked it. We have assumed that the pyramids were always tombs, and therefore their decay was simply decay. But what if they were not always tombs? What if they were machines first and tombs later? What if the assignment of burial functions was secondary to the original purpose? What if the pyramid was built to do something, and then at some point stopped doing it, and then later was repurposed as a royal memorial? And what if the stopping was not natural? What if someone turned it off? And what if the turning off was so complete that even the memory of what it had been was erased, leaving only the shell, only the monument, only the wonder of the ancient world that we see today? I am not claiming this is what happened. I am asking why we have never considered that it might be what happened, because the evidence we have examined points to a structure that was designed as a system that had components which worked together, and that has had every one of those components removed or disabled over time. And the timeline of that removal, the gradual stripping away of one element after another over thousands of years, looks less like natural decay and more like disassembly. And whether that disassembly was accidental or intentional, whether it was the result of neglect or strategy, is a question that the evidence cannot answer. But it is a question worth asking, because we have been looking at the pyramids for centuries, and we have been asking how they were built and what they were for, and perhaps those are not the right questions. Perhaps the right question is what happened to them, what made them stop, and whether that stopping was the end of a story or the middle of one. Whether the pyramids are ruins of something completed or remains of something interrupted. And that question will stay with us as we widen our view, as we step back from Egypt and look at the larger pattern of how power relates to ancient sites. Because the pyramids are not the only place where something stopped, and they are not the only place where the evidence suggests that what we see today is not what was originally there. There is a pattern here, a pattern of ancient systems that were built and then disabled, of ancient knowledge that was accumulated and then lost, of ancient sites that were significant and then became merely archaeological. And that pattern extends far beyond Egypt, into the land where civilization itself is said to have begun, into the region that every empire in history has fought to control, into the place where the oldest stories say the first city was founded by beings who were not human. And to understand what the pyramids might have been, we have to understand what else might have stopped and where and why. And that is where this story goes next. But Egypt is not the only place where something stopped, and the pyramids are not the only structures that draw power toward them. If we step back from the Giza plateau and look at the ancient world as a whole, a pattern begins to emerge that is difficult to explain through conventional reasoning. When empires rise, they do not simply expand outward in all directions like water spreading across a flat surface. They move towards specific places. Nice, they orient themselves towards specific coordinates on the Earth, as if those coordinates exert some kind of gravitational pull on human ambition itself. The most fought-over land in human history is not necessarily the most fertile land or the most strategically positioned land by modern military standards. It is the land that was marked as significant before recorded history began, the land that the oldest civilizations pointed to and said, this place matters, this place was chosen. And so we must turn our attention now to another region, a region that sits roughly 1,000 miles east of Egypt, a region defined by two rivers that flow from the mountains of modern Turkey down through the plains of modern Iraq and into the Persian Gulf. This is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. You have heard this region called the cradle of civilization, and that phrase has been repeated so often that it has lost its strangeness. But consider for a moment what that phrase actually claims. It claims that human civilization, the development of writing and mathematics and astronomy and law and organized religion and urban planning, did not emerge gradually across the entire planet. It emerged here, in this specific river valley, in this narrow strip of land between two specific rivers. The phrase cradle of civilization is not a metaphor. It is a geographic claim. It says that something about this place made it the starting point, the origin, the source from which everything else flowed. And yet we rarely ask why. We accept the phrase as if it explains itself, as if calling a place the cradle of civilization answers the question of why civilization began there rather than somewhere else. But it does not answer that question. It only restates it. Just as the pyramids sit on a specific plateau that seems to have been chosen with extraordinary intention, a plateau of bedrock stable enough to support millions of tons of precisely cut stone, a plateau positioned at a very specific point in the Nile Delta, Mesopotamia occupies a specific river valley that seems to have been chosen with similar intention. The Sumerians, the earliest people we know of who left written records, did not claim that they invented civilization. They claimed they received it. They claimed that beings they called gods came down and established the first city, the first organized human settlement, is at a specific location in southern Mesopotamia. The location they pointed to was a place called Eridu. And what is striking is that archaeology confirms Eridu is indeed one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in the entire region, with settlement layers going back at least 7,000 years. The Sumerians were not inventing a story about a mythical place that never existed. They were pointing to a real location, a location that was ancient even by their standards, and saying that this is where it all began. This is where the gods made their first mark on the earth. Two regions then, Egypt and Mesopotamia, both marked by structures and sites of extraordinary antiquity, both claimed by their earliest inhabitants to have been chosen rather than randomly settled. Both positioned along river systems that made agriculture possible, but that do not fully explain why these specific locations became the anchor points of human civilization. If we track the flow of power through human history, we begin to notice something strange, something that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence once you see it clearly. The Sumerians were first. They built the cities, developed the writing, created the mathematics. Then the Akkadians conquered them around 2300 BCE under a king named Sargon, who created what historians consider the first true empire in human history. The Akkadians did not simply defeat the Sumerians, they absorbed them. They took their language, their gods, their knowledge. Then the Akkadian Empire fell and the Babylonians rose, establishing their capital at Babylon and creating one of the most sophisticated civilizations the ancient world had ever seen. The Babylonians gave us the Code of Hammurabi, systematic astronomy, advances in mathematics. Then the Assyrians came, a military power that conquered Babylon and established an empire known for both its brutality and its scholarship. The Assyrians built vast libraries. They collected texts from every civilization they conquered. Then Persia rose under Cyrus the Great, sweeping across the ancient world and taking Mesopotamia into an empire that stretched from Egypt to India. Then Alexander of Macedon marched east with his Greek army, conquered the Persian Empire, and made Babylon his capital. He died there, in Babylon, planning further conquests. Then Rome extended its reach eastward, pressing against the Parthian and later Sassanid empires for control of Mesopotamia. The eastern frontier of Rome was defined by this land. Then the Islamic conquests of the 7th century brought Mesopotamia under the caliphates, and Baghdad became for a time the most advanced city on earth, a center of learning and culture that preserved and expanded the knowledge of every civilization that had come before. Then the Mongols arrived under Hulagu Khan in 1258 and destroyed Baghdad in one of the most devastating conquests in human history, killing hundreds of thousands and ending the golden age of the caliphate. Then the Ottomans took control and held it for centuries. Then the British arrived in the 20th century and carved new nations out of the old land. Then, in our own lifetime, we have seen American military forces stationed in this same territory. Every major empire that has risen to sufficient power has eventually come for this exact strip of land. This is not a controversial claim. This is simply history, but the pattern itself demands examination. These empires were not all pursuing the same strategic goals. They were not all responding to the same threats. They were not all part of the same cultural lineage. The Mongols had no cultural connection to the Assyrians. The British had no religious connection to the Islamic caliphates. The Americans had no imperial ambitions in the classical sense. And yet each of them, upon reaching a certain threshold of power, moved toward Mesopotamia. It is as if there is something about reaching a certain level of dominance that triggers an awareness, a recognition, perhaps even a compulsion that this land must be held. Empires do not drift into Mesopotamia. They do not stumble upon it accidentally while pursuing other objectives. They march toward it. They prioritize it. They expend enormous resources to reach it and to hold it. The pattern is consistent across 5,000 years and across civilizations that had no way of communicating with each other, no shared culture, no common religion, no continuous political tradition. What explains this? Controlling the land is only the first step. Watch what happens after each empire takes possession. They dig. This behavior is remarkably consistent across eras that otherwise have nothing in common. The Babylonians dug. They excavated older sites. They collected artifacts. They studied the records of civilizations that came before them. The Persians dug. The Greeks dug. The caliphates sponsored scholars who studied ancient texts and ancient ruins. And the British, upon gaining control of Mesopotamia in the early 20th century, immediately launched massive archaeological expeditions. They did not simply govern the territory, they excavated it. They shipped artifacts back to London by the thousands. The British Museum today contains treasures from Mesopotamia that were removed during this period. Entire palace walls covered in carved reliefs depicting Assyrian kings and their conquests. Stone tablets inscribed with some of the earliest writing in human history. Objects that had been buried for thousands of years are brought to the surface and transported halfway around the world to sit in glass cases in a European capital. This is not normal behavior for a conquering power. Empires typically extract resources like gold and oil and agricultural products. They build administrative centers and military installations. They do not typically prioritize archaeology. And yet, in Mesopotamia, archaeology has been a priority for every modern power that has controlled the region. In April of 2003, as American forces entered Baghdad, the Iraq Museum was looted. Approximately 15,000 artifacts were taken in the chaos that followed the invasion. This is documented. This is not disputed. What is less often discussed is what else was happening at the same time. While the museum was being looted, other sites in the city were secured and protected. Resources were allocated. Decisions were made about what to guard and what to leave vulnerable. The script of history does not ask us to assign blame or to make political judgments. It simply asks us to notice the pattern. What determines which sites are protected during the chaos of war? What determines where limited resources are allocated when a government falls and a new power takes control? Across all these eras, from the Babylonians to the British to the present day, the focus has been consistently on what lies beneath the surface. Not the standing architecture, not the visible ruins that any tourist can see. The priority is excavation. The priority is retrieval. The priority is whatever is buried underground, waiting to be found. The question that we must sit with, the question that does not have an easy answer, is why? What do these successive powers believe is underground? What are they looking for beneath the sand and rubble of Mesopotamia? What did the Babylonians hope to find when they dug into even older sites? What did the British hope to find when they shipped thousands of artifacts to London? What is anyone hoping to find? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, has any of them found it? Or is the digging still ongoing because whatever they are searching for remains undiscovered, still buried, still waiting in the oldest layers of the oldest land, beneath a site that the Sumerians said was chosen before humans had any say in the matter at all? To understand why this land matters, we must go back to the people who first told us it mattered. before the Greeks built their temples, before Rome laid its roads, before Egypt raised its final monuments, there was Sumer. The Sumerians emerged in the southern reaches of Mesopotamia sometime around 4500 BCE, settling in the marshy lands where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers approached the Persian Gulf. They did not leave behind pyramids or colossal statues. They left behind something arguably more significant. They left behind words. The Sumerians developed the first known writing system, pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets that hardened into permanence. We call this script cuneiform, and it allowed them to record everything from grain inventories to epic poetry, from legal disputes to astronomical observations. When we speak of history as a written record, we are speaking of a practice the Sumerians invented. Everything before them is prehistory, precisely because they gave us the technology to distinguish between the two. But writing was only one of their contributions. The Sumerians developed the wheel, not merely as a concept, but as a practical technology for transportation and pottery. They created the first known mathematical system based on the number 60, which is why we still divide our hours into 60 minutes and our circles into 360 degrees. They mapped the stars with enough precision that their observations remain useful to astronomers today. They built the first cities, organized the first bureaucracies, codified the first laws. The word civilization itself, derived from the Latin for city dweller, describes a way of life the Sumerians pioneered. They were not primitive people stumbling toward modernity. They were the architects of modernity itself, laying foundations that would support every empire, every nation, every institution that followed. This is not exaggeration. Trace the lineage of Western thought backward through Rome and Greece, backward through Persia and Babylon, and you arrive eventually at Sumer. The Sumerians gave us tools we still use, ideas we still think with, questions we still ask. And yet, for all their documented achievements, for all the tablets they left behind cataloguing their innovations, the Sumerians made a claim about themselves that complicates everything we think we know about the origins of civilization. They said they did not invent it. They said they received it. The Sumerian creation narratives, pieced together from fragments of tablets recovered across multiple archaeological sites, tell a story that differs fundamentally from modern assumptions about how civilization develops. We tend to imagine civilization as an emergence, a gradual process by which scattered human communities slowly accumulated knowledge, developed technologies, and organized themselves into increasingly complex social structures. This is the story we tell in textbooks. It is a story of human ingenuity unfolding over millennia, each generation adding to the inheritance of the previous one. The Sumerians told a different story. They said that before humans had cities, before humans had writing, before humans had any of the technologies that define civilization, the gods descended to Earth. They called these beings the Anunnaki, a term that translates roughly to those who from heaven came down. According to the Sumerian accounts, these beings did not find civilization already developing among humans and decide to help it along. They established civilization from nothing. They chose a location. They built the first city. They gave humans the knowledge required to maintain it. This was not evolution. This was installation. The Sumerians described themselves not as inventors, but as inheritors, not as creators, but as recipients. The knowledge they possessed, by their own account, was given to them complete. The gods selected a place, established the patterns of civilized life, and then entrusted those patterns to humanity. Every king who ruled in Sumer ruled with legitimacy derived from this original bestowal. Every priest who served in the temples served gods who had physically walked the land in an earlier age. Every law that governed behavior was understood to reflect principles established before human memory began. Now, it would be easy to dismiss this as mythology, as the kind of origin story every ancient culture invented to explain its own existence. The Greeks had their Olympians, the Egyptians their Ennead, the Norse their Aesir. Every civilization imagines divine origins. But the Sumerian claim has a specificity that distinguishes it from most creation myths. The Sumerians did not say the gods created the world in some cosmic abstraction. They did not point to the heavens or to a mythical paradise. They pointed to a specific location on Earth, a place you could walk to, a place with coordinates. They said the gods established the first city at a site called Eridu. And here is what makes this claim remarkable. Eridu exists. It is not a mythological construct or a symbolic placeholder. It is an archaeological site in modern-day southern Iraq, approximately 12 kilometers southwest of the ancient city of Ur. You can visit it. You can walk its mounds. You can see the remnants of the structures the Sumerians built there. And when archaeologists began excavating Eridu in the 20th century, they discovered something that aligned with the Sumerian claim in ways that are difficult to dismiss. The settlement layers at Eridu go back at least 7,000 years, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians, who lived around 4,500 BCE, were describing a place that was already ancient by their standards, already layered with thousands of years of human presence. They were not inventing a story about a place that never existed. They were preserving a memory about a place that had been significant since before their own civilization emerged. The earliest structures at Eridu appear to be temples, small shrines that grew larger and more elaborate over time, each new construction built directly on top of the previous one. At the heart of Eridu, archaeologists found a sequence of 18 temples stacked atop one another, the oldest dating to approximately 5,400 BCE. These were not ordinary buildings. They were sacred spaces, dedicated from the earliest recoverable period to a deity the Sumerians called Enki. Enki was the god of water, wisdom, and creation. He was credited in Sumerian mythology with creating humanity itself, fashioning the first humans from clay mixed with the blood of a sacrificed god. He was the keeper of the me, the divine decrees that governed all aspects of civilized life, from kingship to music to the proper conduct of rituals. And his home, according to every Sumerian source, was Eridu. The alignment between myth and archaeology here is striking. The Sumerians said the gods established the first city at Eridu. Archaeology confirms that Eridu contains some of the oldest urban structures in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians said Eridu was sacred to Enki, the god who gave humanity the tools of civilization. Archaeology confirms that the earliest structures at Eridu were temples, suggesting the site was sacred from its inception. The Sumerians said civilization was bestowed, not developed. Archaeology shows that the temples at Eridu were present from the beginning, not added later as the settlement grew. Whatever Eridu was, It was built around a sacred center from its earliest days. Let us look more closely at this place the Sumerians said was chosen first. Eridu today is a series of mounds rising from the flat southern Iraqi desert, sandy hills that give little indication of what lies beneath. The site was first identified by Western archaeologists in the 19th century, but systematic excavation did not begin until the 1940s, when Iraqi archaeologists led by Fuad Safar began uncovering the temple complex. What they found confirmed much of what the Sumerian texts described. The Temple of Enki stood at the center of the ancient city, a ziggurat that had been rebuilt and expanded across millennia. Surrounding it were residential areas, workshops, and what appeared to be administrative buildings. Eridu was a functioning city, and with all the infrastructure that implies. The excavations revealed something else as well. The settlement layers at Eridu are extraordinarily deep, each generation built on top of the previous one, creating a stratigraphic record that extends down through thousands of years of continuous human presence. The upper layers, corresponding to the historical Sumerian period, have been reasonably well documented. The middle layers, corresponding to the earlier Ubaid culture, have been partially explored. But the deepest layers, the oldest layers, the layers that would correspond to the very beginnings of settlement at this site, remain largely unexcavated. This is a remarkable fact when you consider what Eridu represents. If the Sumerian accounts have any basis in reality, if this truly is the site where the first city was established, and then the deepest layers of Eridu would contain evidence of that establishment. They would contain the transition point, the moment when a sacred site became an organized settlement, the moment when what the Sumerians called civilization first took root in human hands. And yet, despite the site being known for over a century, despite the billions of dollars that have been spent on archaeological work throughout Mesopotamia, Eridu has never been fully excavated. The lowest levels remain buried. The reasons for this are multiple and mundane. Wars have repeatedly disrupted archaeological work in Iraq. Funding has been inconsistent. Political instability has made sustained excavation dangerous or impossible for extended periods. These explanations are reasonable. They are probably sufficient, but the result is the same regardless of the cause. The site that the earliest civilization identified as the origin point of all civilization has not been fully examined. Whatever evidence the deepest layers of Eridu might contain remains in the ground. Whatever the Sumerians knew about this place, whatever they were remembering or recording, the physical confirmation or refutation of their claims lies buried beneath the mounds they left behind. We are left with a partial picture, a story half told. The Sumerians pointed to Eridu and said, "This is where it began." Archaeology has confirmed that Eridu is indeed extraordinarily ancient, that it was sacred from its earliest days, that it was a center of civilization before the historical period began. But the final chapter of that story, the deepest layer of that site, the evidence that would tell us what really happened in that place before memory begins, remains unread. From the Sumerians forward, watch how power has moved through this land. The Sumerians did not last forever. No civilization does. Around 2334 BCE, a man named Sargon rose from obscurity to conquer the Sumerian city-states and establish the first empire in human history. Sargon was Akkadian, speaking a Semitic language distinct from Sumerian, but he did not destroy what the Sumerians had built. he absorbed it. The Akkadian Empire adopted Sumerian writing, Sumerian religion, Sumerian administrative practices. The gods of Sumer became the gods of Akkad. The temples continued to function. The knowledge continued to flow. When we speak of civilizational inheritance, this is what we mean. The Akkadians did not merely conquer territory. They inherited a tradition, a way of organizing human life that had been developing since Eridu was first established. They recognized that what the Sumerians possessed was valuable, and they took it for themselves. The Akkadian Empire fell after approximately 2 centuries, fragmenting under pressure from internal strife and external invasion. But the pattern it established would repeat for millennia. The Babylonians rose next, building their capital on the Euphrates and creating one of the ancient world's most magnificent cities. Babylon became a byword for splendor and sophistication, its hanging gardens counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Babylonians inherited Sumerian and Akkadian culture, preserving the old texts, maintaining the old temples, worshipping the old gods under new names. Hammurabi, the Babylonian king, whose law code remains one of the oldest written legal documents, ruled from a tradition that stretched back through Akkad to Sumer, back to Eridu, back to whatever was established there before human record-keeping began. The Assyrians followed, building an empire based on military might and bureaucratic efficiency. The Assyrians were conquerors, brutal and effective, but they were also scholars. They built libraries. They collected texts. When Ashurbanipal established his great library at Nineveh, he sent scribes throughout his empire to copy every important document they could find. Much of what we know about Sumerian civilization, we know because Assyrian scholars considered it worth preserving. They inherited, they collected, they transmitted. The tradition continued. The Persians came next, under Cyrus the Great, is sweeping out of the Iranian plateau to conquer Babylon in 539 BCE. Cyrus was celebrated even by those he conquered for his relative tolerance, his willingness to allow subject peoples to maintain their traditions. The Persians ruled Mesopotamia for 2 centuries, and during that time the old religions continued, the old knowledge persisted, the chain of transmission remained unbroken. Then came Alexander. In 331 BCE, Alexander of Macedon defeated the Persian king Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela and became master of Mesopotamia. Alexander was not merely a conqueror. He was a student of Aristotle, a man who believed in the value of knowledge, who traveled with scholars and scientists in his retinue. When Alexander entered Babylon, he did not sack it. He honored its traditions. He planned to make it a capital of his world empire. He died there in 323 BCE in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, struck down by fever or poison or the accumulated toll of his campaigns. He was 32 years old and ruler of the largest empire the world had yet seen, and he chose to die in Babylon, in the heart of Mesopotamia, in the land the Sumerians said the gods had chosen first. Rome extended its reach to the Euphrates, but never fully conquered Mesopotamia. The Parthians held the land, then the Sassanids, Persian dynasties that maintained their ancient traditions even as new religions emerged and spread. When Islam arose in the 7th century CE, when the Arab armies swept out of the desert to conquer an empire of their own, Mesopotamia fell under their control. The Abbasid Caliphate made Baghdad their capital, building a new city on the Tigris that became the center of the medieval world. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad collected and translated texts from every civilization the Caliphate had conquered. Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Persian astronomy all flowed into Baghdad and were synthesized by scholars who saw themselves as inheritors of ancient traditions. The chain continued, link by link, empire by empire. The Mongols came in 1258, and what they did to Baghdad remains one of history's great atrocities. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, besieged the city and took it after a brief resistance. The caliph was executed. The population was massacred. The great libraries were destroyed, their contents thrown into the Tigris until, according to legend, the river ran black with ink. What the Mongols destroyed cannot be calculated. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, manuscripts that existed nowhere else, records of traditions that stretched back to Sumer, all lost in a week of fire and slaughter. And yet, Mesopotamia endured. The Mongols withdrew. New powers rose. The Ottomans incorporated the region into their empire, ruling from Istanbul for 4 centuries. The British arrived in the 20th century, carving up the Ottoman domains after World War I and creating the modern nation of Iraq. The Americans came in 2003 for reasons still debated and occupied the land for years. The pattern is relentless. Every great power at the peak of its influence eventually comes for this land. They do not drift here by accident. They march with purpose. They recognize, on some level that may never be fully articulated, that this place matters in ways that transcend ordinary strategic calculation. And when they arrive, they do not merely govern. They investigate. They dig. They search for something. But why here? Of all the places on Earth, why do these coordinates matter? The conventional explanations are not wrong. Mesopotamia sits at the heart of the Fertile Crescent, the arc of relatively well-watered land that stretches from the Nile to the Persian Gulf. The Tigris and Euphrates provided water for irrigation, enabling agriculture in a region that would otherwise be too dry to support large populations. The geographic position is strategically significant, linking the Mediterranean world to Central Asia, providing access to trade routes that have been valuable for millennia. These factors explain much. They explain why civilization might develop here, why trade might flow through here, why empires might want to control the region. But they do not explain the intensity. Fertile land exists in many places. River systems exist on every continent. Strategic positions are numerous. Why does no other region on Earth show the same pattern of continuous imperial focus for 5,000 unbroken years? Consider the Nile Valley. Egypt was a great civilization, influential and long-lasting. But Egypt also had extended periods of relative isolation, centuries when foreign powers largely left it alone. Consider China, which developed independently and was conquered at various points, but whose pattern of imperial conflict differs markedly from Mesopotamia's. Consider India, wealthy and sophisticated, fought over by various powers, but not with the same relentless consistency. Mesopotamia is unique. The pattern does not replicate elsewhere. Something about this specific land, these specific coordinates, has drawn power toward it with an intensity that ordinary strategic factors cannot fully explain. The Sumerians had an answer. They said this land was chosen, not by humans, not through the gradual processes of historical development, but chosen, selected, marked as significant by beings who came before. The modern mind dismisses this as mythology. We have been trained to interpret ancient god talk as primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena, as personifications of forces that science has since demystified. When the Sumerians said the gods chose this land, we assume they were speaking metaphorically, that they were expressing in religious language something that has a rational, secular explanation. But what if we are wrong? Not wrong about the details, perhaps, but wrong about the framing. What if the Sumerians were describing something that actually happened, using the only conceptual vocabulary available to them? When a pre-scientific culture encounters something beyond its comprehension, it reaches for the only framework it has. It calls what it cannot understand divine. It describes what it cannot explain as the work of gods. This does not mean the Sumerians were lying or fantasizing. It means they were limited by language, by concepts, by the tools available for making sense of their experience. What if the gods chose this land is a mythological encoding of an actual event? What if something did select this location? Did mark it as significant? Did establish patterns here that would echo through 5,000 years of human history? We cannot prove this. We cannot disprove it either. We can only note the pattern, observe the consistency, and ask whether our explanations are sufficient. Every major empire that has risen to dominance has eventually oriented itself toward Mesopotamia. Every occupier has exhibited the same behavior, arriving, securing, then searching for something. The digging, the excavating, the desperate interest in what lies beneath. The Sumerians said the gods chose this land before humans had any say in it. Every conquest since has been an echo of whatever happened here first. The deepest layers of Eridu remain unexcavated. Whatever was placed here at the beginning, whatever was established before history began, is still in the ground, waiting. The audience should feel that they have arrived at something that cannot be explained away, only contemplated. Some questions do not have answers. They have weight. We began with a pyramid that stopped working, and we end with a city that may never have started. A mound rising from the southern Iraqi desert, where the wind moves across excavation trenches that have sat quiet for decades. Where the temples above ground have been mapped and photographed and documented in academic papers that gather dust in university libraries, where the residential quarters have been measured and dated and assigned their place in the chronology of human settlement, but where the deepest layers remain exactly where they have always been, beneath the surface. Beneath the foundations of temples built and rebuilt over millennia, beneath the accumulated debris of 7,000 years of continuous human presence, still in the earth, still untouched, still waiting for someone to dig down far enough to reach whatever lies at the bottom. Eridu today is not a destination, not a tourist site, not a place that appears on itineraries or inspires pilgrimages. It is a lonely mound surrounded by flat desert that stretches to the horizon in every direction. A place where the only sounds are wind and the occasional passage of military vehicles in the distance. A place that feels forgotten, even though it may be the most important piece of ground on the planet if the people who first settled here were telling the truth about what happened. The Sumerians did not claim to have invented civilization. They claimed to have received it. And this distinction matters more than almost anything else they left behind, because it inverts everything we think we know about how the human story began. They said the gods came down, beings they called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, and these beings did not arrive randomly, did not scatter themselves across the globe, did not choose a place by accident or convenience. They selected this specific location, this particular bend in the river, this exact set of coordinates, and they established here the first city, the first organized human settlement, the template from which all subsequent civilization would flow. They called this place Eridu, and they said it was the beginning of everything. Not because humans decided to build here, but because something older than humanity marked this ground as the starting point. The temples they built at Eridu were dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom, the god of water, the god of the underground freshwater ocean they believed existed beneath the earth. And these temples were rebuilt again and again over thousands of years, each new structure erected directly on top of the previous one, creating layers of sacred architecture that descended into the ground like geological strata, each layer representing a generation that remembered what this place meant, even if they no longer fully understood why. Archaeologists have documented 18 distinct temple levels at Eridu, 18 successive structures built over a span of nearly 4,000 years, each one honoring the same deity, each one occupying the same sacred footprint, each one adding another layer to the accumulated weight of human reverence for this specific piece of ground. And yet, beneath the 18th level, beneath the oldest temple structure that has been excavated, there is more. There are earlier layers that have never been fully explored, depths that have never been reached, foundations that may predate anything we currently recognize as civilization. The conventional narrative tells us the Sumerians were the beginning, the origin point, the first people to develop writing and mathematics and astronomy and law, the first people to organize themselves into cities and create the structures of civilization that every subsequent culture would inherit and adapt. But the Sumerians themselves told a different story. They said they were not the beginning, but the inheritors. Not the inventors, but the recipients. Not the originators, but the ones who received something that already existed and were given the task of carrying it forward. If we take this claim seriously, and the pattern of history suggests we should at least consider it, then everything changes, because it means the Sumerians did not start the story of human civilization. They entered a story that was already in progress. They took possession of something that had been placed here before they arrived. And every empire that has marched toward this land in the 5,000 years since has been doing the same thing, reaching for something that predates all of them, trying to reconnect with whatever was established here first. This is the original claim, the foundational assertion that this land was chosen before humans had any say in it, that something was placed here that matters in ways we do not fully understand, that the significance of Mesopotamia is not a historical accident, but a designation, a marking, a selection made by intelligences or forces that operated on timescales we cannot comprehend. And the Sumerians were simply the first to write it down, the first to leave a record that we could eventually read, the first to tell us in their own words what they believed about why this place matters. And so, we are left with questions that do not resolve, questions that have carried us from the gleaming white shell of a pyramid that once reflected the desert sun across 100 miles to a silent mound in southern Iraq, where the wind moves through empty excavation trenches, on questions about what function the pyramids actually served and what shut them down, and whether that shutdown was deliberate. Questions about what keeps pulling power toward Mesopotamia, and why every empire that rises to sufficient dominance eventually marches toward this exact strip of land. Questions about what lies in the deepest layers of Eridu, and why those layers have never been fully excavated despite decades of archaeological interest and billions of dollars spent digging elsewhere. Questions about what the Sumerians actually knew and how they came to know it, and whether their stories about gods descending from heaven contain some seed of genuine memory wrapped in the language of myth. We do not have answers to these questions. We may never have answers. The evidence allows us to speculate and wonder and construct theories, but it does not allow us to conclude. The pattern is visible, but the explanation remains hidden, and perhaps this is exactly as it should be. Perhaps the value lies not in the answers, but in the questions themselves, in the willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than rushing to fill it with comfortable explanations that let us believe we understand what we do not. We have spent thousands of years assuming we understand the ancient world, categorizing it and labeling it and filing it away in museums and textbooks. We have decided what the pyramids were for, and we have decided what Mesopotamia means, and we have decided that the Sumerian stories about gods and origins are myths, charming relics of a primitive imagination that had not yet developed the scientific frameworks we now take for granted. But what if we are wrong? Not about the facts, because the facts are documented. Not about the archaeology, because the archaeology is rigorous, but about the framing, about the assumptions we bring to the evidence, about the conclusions we draw from patterns we have chosen not to see. What if the pyramids were not tombs, but machines? Structures designed to perform a function we no longer recognize? Systems that required specific components to operate? And what if they did not simply decay over time, but were systematically disabled? Their casing stones stripped away, their water sources diverted, their capstones removed, each functional element taken apart until what remained was only the skeleton of something that once worked. What if Mesopotamia is not significant because civilization happened to develop there, but because something marked it as significant before civilization existed, before humans had writing or cities, or any of the tools we associate with the beginning of history? And what if every empire that has conquered this land in the millennia since has been responding to that original marking, drawn toward these coordinates by something older than any of them understood? What if the Sumerian gods were not imagination, but memory, not fantasy, but an attempt to describe something real in the only language available? And what if the story they told about Eridu being the first city, the place where the gods came down and established civilization, was not a creation myth in the way we typically understand that term, but a record, imperfect and filtered through thousands of years of retelling of something that actually happened? We cannot know. We may never know. And perhaps that is the most honest place to end, not with a revelation, but with an invitation to remain open to the possibility that the ancient world was stranger than we have allowed ourselves to believe, that the structures left behind were more than monuments and more than tombs, that the land fought over for 5,000 years is more than strategic territory, that the stories told by the oldest civilization are more than myth. The mound of Eridu sits in the desert as twilight settles across the plain, the layers still in the ground, the depths still unexcavated. The original claims still buried beneath millennia of accumulated earth, still waiting for someone to dig down far enough to reach whatever was placed there first. Still waiting for someone to ask the right questions, still waiting.